Welcome to the Deep Dive. We have pulled together your sources for an exploration into a field that, well, it fundamentally remaps the terrain of human decision-making. We are diving deep into behavioral economics.
And this is a field that blends psychology, neuroscience, and microeconomic theory. Our mission today is pretty straightforward. We want to give you a complete, thorough understanding of the foundational concepts, the key theories, and, the really startling real-world implications of a science that maps the cognitive shortcuts our brains take every single day.
That's right. I mean, whether you are choosing a career, negotiating a salary, or just deciding whether to hit the snooze button, this science has a framework for understanding your process. Okay, let's unpack this. Maybe we should start at the beginning. The crisis of rationality.
Right. Before we had behavioral economics, we had the classical view. In traditional economics, it relies entirely on this concept of homo economicus.
The economic man.
Exactly. This is the idealized, purely rational, perfectly self-interested decision maker, the kind of economic agent who have unlimited computational power and access to all the necessary information, calculating every choice to maximize their own long-term utility.
It's an elegant mathematical concept, I'll give it that, but I always found it a bit cold. It assumes we all function like spreadsheets. But what happens when reality, with all its complex emotions and impulse buys and procrastination, what happens when that doesn't match the clean mathematics?
Well, that gap, that's everything. That systematic deviation from the predicted rational path, that is the engine of behavioral economics. The field studies the psychological factors, cognitive processes, affective or, emotional responses and social influences that are involved in our economic decisions. And it specifically looks at how those decisions violate the assumptions of the traditional models.
And what's fascinating here is that the idea that people aren't perfectly rational, I mean, that actually goes way, way back. We can trace this critique back to the father of classical economics himself, Adam Smith.
Absolutely. Smith, in The Theory of Moral Sentiments, which was published way back in 1759, he discussed phenomena that modern BE would call loss aversion and overconfidence. Early classical thinkers, including Jeremy Bentham, they frequently used psychological reasoning. They conceptualized utility itself as a product of our internal hedonic psychology.
So if psychology was there at the very start, why did it get completely eliminated from economic theory in the early 1900s? Why the sudden divorce?
It was driven by twin pressures. First, there's a growing lack of confidence in those early hedonic theories, the ones based on pursuing maximum benefit. And that was mainly because they were proving pretty poor at accurately predicting real-world behavior.
Okay.
Secondly, and this is maybe more important for the academic trajectory of the discipline, there was a profound fear among economists that incorporating subjective psychological elements would undermine the field's increasing reliance on advanced mathematical components.
The drive for mathematics and scientific rigor.
Precisely. They preferred to focus on measurable, tangible phenomena, prices, quantities, incomes, rather than unscientific, messy psychological states. So models that depended on psychological insights, they just became rare. And the concept of homo economicus became the central dominant assumption. It simplified everything down to constrained optimization problems. This lasted for decades.
But that long winter for psychological realism, it finally broke in the 1960s with what's called the cognitive revolution.
That's when the relationship was rekindled. Psychologists like Ward Edwards and then later Amos Tversky and Daniel Kahneman, they began developing these sophisticated cognitive models of decision-making under risk and uncertainty. And they compared their findings directly against the standard economic models. This spurred a realization among economists that ignoring psychological reality meant sacrificing predictive power. And so the foundational practice of modern behavioral economics was born, taking standard models and building upon them by applying psychological reality to enhance their accuracy.
That historical context is so crucial because it leads us directly to the first major pillar of this field. This explains why the rational agent model is flawed. We are not perfect information processors. Let's talk about bounded rationality.
Bounded rationality is the recognition that individuals, when they're making decisions, are rational only within certain limits. Their ability to achieve optimal outcomes is constrained by three critical factors: the sheer complexity of the decision problem they face, their inherent cognitive limitations — I mean, we simply don't have unlimited memory or processing speed — and the time available to them to make a choice.
And this concept was pioneered by Herbert A. Simon, who received the Nobel Prize in 1978 largely for this work. It fundamentally challenged that idea that rationality equals optimization.
Right. Simon suggested we look at the decision maker through the analogy of a pair of scissors, which I think is just incredibly illustrative. One blade of the scissors is the cognitive limitation, the limits of the human mind. The other blade is the structures of the environment. We are constantly trying to compensate for our limited mental resources by exploiting known structural regularity in our environment.
So if I know the milk is always in the back right corner of the grocery store, I don't have to spend mental energy searching for it every time. I'm using that environmental structure to make up for my finite processing power.
Exactly. And because we are bounded, we can't afford the luxury of always optimizing. This limitation leads to a different decision strategy that Simon termed satisficing.
Right, so instead of aiming for the absolute best outcome, we aim for the good enough outcome.
Precisely. The term satisficing is a portmanteau. It blends satisfy and suffice. Instead of engaging in a costly, exhaustive assessment of all available options to find the global optimum, which takes a massive amount of time and effort, agents just settle for an acceptable solution. They establish a minimum aspiration level and then stop searching once that requirement has been met, and that saves on deliberation costs.
This is incredibly relatable. I mean, when you're searching for an apartment, you don't look at every single one in the city. You search until you find one that meets your minimum criteria for rent, location, size, and then you sign the lease, even though a hypothetically better one might exist somewhere out there.
And that's efficient, even if it's not optimal. The cost of searching for that tiny bit of extra utility often outweighs the benefit. This framework proved highly valuable when applied beyond the individual.
So how did Simon's work translate to organizations? You mentioned the work of Sert and March.
Right. Richard Seart and James March formalized this in their 1963 landmark work, A Behavioral Theory of the Firm. They moved away from the idea of the firm as a single, purely maximizing entity. Instead, they viewed firms as coalitions of diverse internal groups, like marketing, finance, and production, each with conflicting objectives. So the firm's targets, they're not about maximizing abstract profit potential, but about meeting acceptable negotiated requirements for these various groups. Their behavior is determined by satisficing targets, like achieving a certain market share or maintaining a specified inventory level, rather than continuous maximization.
That makes the firm look a lot more human and less like some calculating robot. This foundational understanding that we rely on these systematic shortcuts due to bounded rationality is precisely what gave researchers the opening to study the structure of these predictable errors, which leads us directly into prospect theory.
That's the perfect bridge, yes. Once you accept that agents are predictably limited, well, the next step is mapping those limitations mathematically.
And here's where it gets really interesting, and arguably where the field truly exploded into the mainstream consciousness. The work of Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky. Their collaboration in the 70s and 80s culminated in their groundbreaking 1979 paper that introduced prospect theory. What did they find about how we value things under risk?
Prospect theory was revolutionary because it was the first widely accepted model to fully integrate cognitive psychology to explain why economic decisions diverge so systematically from the predictions of expected utility theory. They mapped our valuation process not based on final wealth states, but based on three key psychological generalizations.
Okay, what are they?
First, they established that gains are treated differently than losses. Second, outcomes that are received with certainty are overweighed relative to uncertain outcomes. And third, that the structure and presentation of the problem significantly affects our choices.
And their methodology was just brilliant because it showed that if you simply rephrase the exact same problem from a positive frame, like achieving a gain, to a negative frame, averting a loss, people's preferences completely flip.
Yes. The classic Asian disease problem is the perfect illustration of these framing effects. When respondents were asked to choose between two programs to combat a disease expected to kill 600 people, well, framing the options in terms of lives saved, so gains, led to a preference for the certain low-risk option. But when the exact same statistical outcomes were framed in terms of lives lost, or losses, respondents overwhelmingly shifted their preference to the riskier, uncertain option. This showed that the visceral fear of loss was driving their decisions, overriding pure rational calculation.
And this leads us directly to the core mechanism you mentioned, loss aversion.
Loss aversion is arguably the single most important contribution of prospect theory. It states that the negative emotional impact of a loss is significantly greater than the positive emotional impact of an equivalent gain. And to quantify this, Kahneman and Tversky, in their 1992 revision, they provided the median coefficient gator. Losses hurt about 2.25 times more than equivalent gains reward.
Wow, that is a fundamental asymmetry in the human response system. For you, the listener, imagine losing $100. That psychological pain requires the positive feeling of gaining $225 just to bring you back to an emotional break-even point. This has massive implications, especially in finance.
It does. This behavior is rooted in what they call reference dependence. Utility isn't calculated based on your absolute wealth, but on changes relative to a specific reference level, often the current status quo or the expectations you held prior to the decision. So outcomes are classified instantly as gains or losses relative to that point, and agents will expend disproportionate effort trying to avoid losses compared to achieving equivalent gains.
This explains phenomena like why people hold on to bad stocks longer than they should, right? They're hoping they'll just break even so they can avoid crystallizing the loss. The pain of selling at a loss outweighs the rational decision to cut bait and reinvest elsewhere.
Exactly. Now, we also need to address the second critical psychological element embedded in prospect theory, the way we handle probabilities. You mentioned that certainty is overweighed.
Yes, the nonlinear probability weighting. That sounds quite technical. Can you break down what that means for our everyday decision making?
Absolutely. So, traditional models assume we treat probabilities linearly. A 5% chance of winning is exactly 5 times better than a 1% chance, but prospect theory demonstrates that we just don't do that. We exhibit an inverse X-shaped probability weighting function. This means two things. We disproportionately overweigh small probabilities, and we disproportionately underweigh high probabilities.
Okay, give us an example of overweighing small probabilities.
Think about buying lottery tickets or highly specialized expensive insurance for a highly unlikely event like a plane crash. The probability of that event occurring is minuscule, but because we overweight that tiny chance, we are willing to pay more for the low probability of a huge gain, the lottery, or to avoid the low probability of a devastating loss. The insurance.
And the flip side, underweighing high probabilities.
That manifests as dismissing risks that are highly likely but not yet certain. For example, ignoring clear warnings about maintenance on your car, or underestimating the high likelihood of rain, or failing to wear a seatbelt, even though the risk is significant. We are sensitive to the extremes, but we are relatively insensitive to moderate probabilities. Yeah. The difference between a 95% chance and a 100% chance feels massive, even though mathematically it's just 5%.
Right.
This difference is called the certainty effect, and it makes us extremely risk-averse when we're faced with certain gains, but risk-seeking when faced with certain losses.
The theoretical insights from bounded rationality and, the specific cognitive mapping of prospect theory, they naturally laid the groundwork for the third major pillar, practical application. This is nudge theory, popularized by Richard Thaler and Cass Sunstein. This is where the science of predictable irrationality meets real-world policy design.
That's right. Once you know the cognitive shortcuts and biases people use, you can engineer the environment to channel those shortcuts toward better outcomes. Thaler and Sunstein define a nudge precisely. Any aspect of the choice architecture that alters people's behavior in a predictable way without forbidding any options or significantly changing their economic incentives.
The key part being that the intervention must be easy and cheap to avoid. So changing the default setting on a form is a nudge, but financially penalizing a certain choice is not.
This defines their whole philosophical approach, which they term libertarian paternalism. Paternalism because the goal is to guide individuals toward decisions that improve their welfare, but libertarian because freedom of choice is maintained. The intervention must always be easy to bypass. The people designing these environments, they're called choice architects.
So if I walk into a cafeteria, the choice architect, knowing I suffer from bounded rationality and present bias, designs the environment to make the healthy option the easiest option.
Exactly. They capitalize on judgmental heuristics, or what Kahneman refers to as System 1, that fast thinking. By altering the decision environment, the choice architecture, they ensure that the automatic, quick decision results in the most positive or desired outcome, bypassing the need for slow, effortful System 2 calculation.
A perfect example cited in the sources is the placement of food. If you put healthier items like fruit at eye level and next to the cash register, and then relocate the junk food further away, you're leveraging design to shift the default choice.
And this approach quickly moved from academic theory into public policy all around the globe. The most famous early example was the formation of the British Behavioral Insights Team, famously nicknamed the Nudge Unit back in 2010.
Can you give us a sense of the scale of application? I mean, beyond just where food is placed.
Oh, the applications are widespread. In financial policy, nudges are used heavily for retirement savings, notably auto-enrollment in 401k plans. Because people suffer from status quo bias and inertia, making participation the default option dramatically increases enrollment rates.
That makes sense.
In corporate environments, the concept has been applied to health, safety, and environment, or HSE goals, designing processes to reduce human error. Public health policies have adopted nudges through things like highly visible nutrition labeling and strategically levied taxes on sugar-sweetened beverages to gently shift consumption patterns.
That's powerful, using our knowledge of our own flaws to help fix those flaws. But you mentioned they also introduced a concept for the opposite phenomenon.
Yes, the anti-nudge, if you will, sludge. While nudges make beneficial actions easier, sludge refers to unnecessary frictions or barriers that make beneficial actions harder. Think of confusing, overly bureaucratic forms for accessing benefits, or complex sign-up processes, or hidden fees buried deep in financial contracts.
So if the government wants people to save more, they implement a nudge, like auto-enrollment. But if a company wants to prevent people from canceling a service, they implement sludge, like making the cancellation form 10 pages long.
Precisely. Policy initiatives now often involve both eliminating sludge, so cleaning up processes and removing complexity, and implementing beneficial nudges. However, the field isn't without its significant ethical discussions, stemming from the very nature of, well, manipulation.
We should probably touch on that ethical dimension briefly. Critics charge that, even if it's well-intentioned, designing an environment to trick people into making a better choice still diminishes their autonomy.
That's a key point of critique. Manipulation versus persuasion. Critics debate whether nudging, especially if the target is unaware they're being influenced, crosses an ethical boundary. And, there's a practical critique too. As we discussed, nudges capitalize on System 1 thinking. If an individual, through the nudge, never engages in System 2, that reflective thought, they never learn the underlying rational decision-making process. The behavior might be beneficial in the moment, but the fundamental cognitive flaw remains unaddressed.
Beyond the big three foundational theories, behavioral economics provides us with this extensive catalog of the specific recurring mental shortcuts and systematic errors that define our predictability. Let's run through the ultimate toolkit of the mind, the biases, fallacies, and heuristics that you, the listener, will recognize in your own financial and personal choices.
We categorize these as heuristics, which are practical mental shortcuts, and biases, fallacies, which are the systematic errors that result when those shortcuts are misapplied.
We already covered the foundational search heuristic, satisficing, but let's look at another major one, elimination by aspects.
This is a complex but really common strategy, especially for large purchases. Instead of comparing choices holistically, you compare specific qualities. You choose the quality you value most, say gas mileage for a car, and set a minimum aspiration level for it. You eliminate all cars that don't meet that minimum. Then you repeat the process with the next most valued quality, like safety ratings, until only one option remains. It's an effective way to simplify overwhelming complexity without having to weigh dozens of trade-offs at the same time.
Now let's move into the cognitive effects, the ways we mentally categorize value, starting with mental accounting.
Mental accounting. This is the propensity to allocate resources for specific purposes, separating money into these distinct mental accounts based on its source or intention or even an emotional connection. For example, treating money you get as a tax refund differently than money you earn from a normal salary, even though economically a dollar is the dollar.
The classic example is why people might maintain savings accounts earning like 0% interest, while simultaneously carrying high-interest credit card debt. Rationally, they should pay off the debt, but they categorize the savings as a sacred emergency fund that can't be touched, even while they're incurring massive interest fees on the spending account.
That separation demonstrates the powerful emotional weight of these mental boundaries. The different labels change the economic outcome. Another critical cognitive bias is anchoring.
Anchoring is having a mental reference point that disproportionately influences your subsequent estimates or decisions.
Right. Think about negotiation. If a seller initially quotes a wildly high price for a house, even if the buyer negotiates it down significantly, that final negotiated price is often still higher than it would have been if the seller had started with a moderate quote. That initial high number serves as the anchor, biasing the entire process.
Or even more practically, when stores put signs up saying limit 4 per customer. Even if you only wanted one, that anchor of 4 subtly pushes you to consider buying more.
Absolutely. The anchor sets the cognitive starting point. If you anchor your expectations low, say, expecting a miserable rainy week and then the sun comes out, you get higher utility from the pleasant weather than if you had simply expected good weather all along.
We already discussed loss aversion and the role of framing effects. Let's move to how we handle time and probability, starting with present bias.
Present bias reflects our innate impatience. It's the willingness to forego a greater payoff in the future in favor of receiving a smaller but immediate benefit. We discount future rewards way too steeply.
This is the battle against procrastination, right? Foregoing the long-term benefit of a high grade for the immediate small reward of watching Netflix.
Precisely. And the field differentiates between actors based on their awareness. A naive actor is unaware they suffer from present bias. They're constantly promising themselves they'll start the diet or save money tomorrow, and then they're genuinely surprised when tomorrow arrives and they revert to the instant gratification choice. A sophisticated actor, on the other hand, is aware of their time inconsistency. They will actively seek out commitment devices, like signing up for a gym membership with strict cancellation penalties, to force their future self to behave rationally.
That distinction, naive versus sophisticated, is key because it suggests different policy interventions are needed for different people.
It does. Now let's tackle the gaming fallacies, how we misuse probability in sequential events. All right. First, the gambler's fallacy. This is the belief that random events are self-correcting. If a roulette wheel lands on red 3 times in a row, a person influenced by this fallacy believes black is due, thinking the sequence needs to balance out. This ignores the mathematical reality that each spin is an independent event with a constant 50% probability.
And the opposite of that, which we see constantly in sports commentary, is the hot hand fallacy.
Right. If a basketball player makes 3 shots in a row, we often believe they are on form or have a hot hand, and we predict their streak will continue. Again, this is often a statistical illusion. While streaks happen, we tend to over-attribute those streaks to innate skill or probability changes, rather than just random variation, leading to an overestimation of success probability.
And what about the simple recency bias?
Recency bias is the tendency to assign greater probability to an outcome simply because it just occurred. If the last 2 market fluctuations were positive, a person with recency bias is more likely to predict the next one will also be positive, even if long-term trends suggest otherwise.
Finally, let's consider the biases related to inertia and ownership. Status quo bias and the endowment effect.
Status quo bias is our deep-seated preference for sticking with the current state of affairs. Change requires effort, and it introduces risk, and we are fundamentally averse to both. This is exactly why auto-enrollment in retirement plans work so well. The default option leverages our inertia.
And the endowment effect.
Closely connected. This is the observation that people value things they own significantly more than they value things they do not yet possess. If I own a specific coffee mug, I might demand $20 to sell it. But if I didn't own it, I would only be willing to pay $10 to acquire it. The mere fact of ownership creates a psychological premium.
That ties back perfectly to loss aversion, doesn't it? Giving up the mug is perceived as a loss, which is valued higher than the equivalent monetary gain.
Absolutely. The endowment effect is essentially loss aversion applied to possessions. These dozens of systematic missteps, taken together, form the predictable landscape of human decision-making that behavioral economics maps out.
And behavioral economics isn't confined to a laboratory or academic papers anymore. It is deeply embedded across disciplines. It changed finance with behavioral finance, explaining irrational systematic errors in markets, contrary to the efficient market hypothesis. And we even see it utilized in artificial intelligence, where intelligent machines can actively mitigate the constraints of bounded rationality by synthesizing massive amounts of information to lower asymmetry and improve decision-making.
One of the most fascinating and impactful areas, though, is behavioral development economics, which studies economic decision-making in low-income countries. This area is critical because non-standard economic behavior is often more pronounced in the global south due to the severe interaction between standard cognitive biases and high poverty rates.
That's a powerful insight. The experience of scarcity itself actually reduces your mental bandwidth. This goes beyond simple stress.
It does. Scarcity, whether of money or time, consumes cognitive resources. It forces your attention to narrow intensely onto immediate financial concerns, reducing the mental capacity available for complex problem-solving or planning or education. While this focused attention might improve immediate, localized decisions like rationing supplies until the next payday, The overall effect of constant financial stress is detrimental to long-term cognitive function and planning quality.
And there's hard data supporting this cognitive burden. Tell us about the study on Indian sugarcane farmers.
This was a landmark field study. Researchers found that Indian sugarcane farmers exhibited significantly lower cognitive performance on standard tests before the harvest when money was tight and they faced high scarcity and debt burdens. Crucially, their cognitive performance improved significantly post-harvest when their financial situation stabilized. The finding suggests that poverty itself imposes a temporary cognitive tax equivalent to losing several points of IQ. It illustrates that poor decisions might be driven by poverty-induced cognitive load, not just fixed individual traits.
That completely reframes the entire discussion on poverty and decision-making.
It forces us to consider the environmental constraints imposed by scarcity. And this understanding is transforming labor markets in low-income settings. For instance, in countries like Ethiopia, workers in new industrial jobs often quickly quit or migrate because they value flexibility highly to meet unpredictable demands on their time, a time scarcity preference rarely seen in high-income settings.
And we noted the fascinating counterintuitive finding about self-control problems in these markets.
Yes, this is where the concept of the sophisticated actor comes back into play. Low-income workers often voluntarily choose to opt into dominated contracts, so contracts that contain strict penalties for underperformance or provide lower overall pay.
Why would they do that?
Because they are aware of their own self-control problems or time inconsistency. By choosing the penalty-laden contract, it serves as a commitment mechanism, forcing their future self to increase productivity. It's a sophisticated economic choice made specifically to overcome an acknowledged behavioral flaw.
But the field isn't without its critics. After all, if behavioral economics is so groundbreaking, why did the standard neoclassical model based on the rational agent hold such sway for so long? And why do some traditional economists still stress its relevance?
The primary challenge comes from those who argue that individual irrationality often, it washes out at the market level, meaning that the crucial macro-level result of standard economics still hold true. Two landmark papers, published before the emergence of modern BE, provided robust justification for maintaining neoclassical analysis without needing to assume individual rationality.
Let's start with Armin Alchian's 1950 paper. What was his core argument?
Alchian used the logic of natural selection, what is sometimes called the evolutionary landscape model. He argued that even if individual firms make random or irrational decisions, only those firms that happen to maximize profits or at least avoid severe losses survive the competitive pressure of the market. So over time, the market selects for the outcomes consistent with rational profit maximization, even if the underlying decisions of the managers were not consciously rational. The environment dictates the structure of success, not the individual's perfect foresight.
So profit maximization is achieved through the evolutionary pressure of competition, not necessarily through perfect, deliberate calculation by every single actor.
Exactly. Then there's Gary Becker's 1962 paper, which provided a similar defense of a fundamental economic law, the downward-sloping market demand curve.
The idea that as price goes down, demand goes up.
Becker showed that this most important implication of the law of demand doesn't actually require consumers to be rational utility maximizers. It follows from a very wide variety of irrational behaviors too, simply due to the effect of price changes on wealth and opportunity. If a price goes down, people have more effective wealth, and they will likely buy more of something, even if their consumption behavior is erratic. The market aggregation holds up even if the individual choices are arbitrary.
So in essence, the critique is behavioral findings are compelling in the lab, but do they scale up to invalidate market-level predictability?
That's the core tension. And then there are the methodological critiques, which are harder to dismiss.
You mentioned the problem of generalizability, often summarized by the acronym WEIRD.
Yes. A significant criticism is that many foundational behavioral studies rely heavily on weird populations, Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic subjects. This raises serious questions about the external validity and generalizability of the findings to the vast majority of the world's population who do not fit that profile. We have to ask whether cognitive shortcuts observed in American college students operate identically in other cultures or socioeconomic contexts.
And finally, there's the replicability crisis, particularly regarding long-term policy interventions.
This is a major concern facing the field. Behavioral economists have openly acknowledged that many studies suffer from small effect sizes and limited sample diversity. Crucially, when policy interventions like nudges are implemented and then retested in complex real-world conditions over extended periods, a recent review reported that fewer than half of these experiments sustain their long-term impact. The temporary nudge effect often fades, bringing into question the enduring efficacy of these interventions.
So that suggests that while behavioral economics is exceptional at mapping how behavior deviates, the critics want the field to spend more time answering why people behave the way they do, which is necessary for creating enduring scientific knowledge and long-term policy success.
It's a push toward greater theoretical integration and more robust testing in diverse environments. But despite these critiques, the integrated approach remains the current dominant trajectory in economic modeling.
What we've discussed today, from the cognitive limits defined by Herbert Simon, the nonlinear valuation mapped by Kahneman and Tversky, and the policy application of Thaler's nudge, it shows that while we may not be purely rational, we are certainly predictably irrational. Behavioral economics provides a comprehensive map of those predictions.
That is the enduring legacy. It's shifted the focus from asking if people make good choices, which often led to prescriptive failure, to asking how they can be helped to make better ones by designing smarter environments. And this integrated approach has been overwhelmingly validated by the highest honors in the field.
So what does this all mean for you, the listener? Well, the next time you find yourself sticking with a familiar, mediocre option due to familiarity bias or avoiding a sound investment because the potential for loss just feels too painful, that's loss aversion, you now have the sophisticated terminology for that mental reflex. Knowing the map of your own cognitive pitfalls is the first step toward navigating them.
Final provocative thought for you. If artificial intelligence and machine learning models are increasingly built to utilize these exact behavioral economic insights, for instance, generating conditional rules, capturing customer behaviors based on their known biases, does understanding your own systematic errors become the most important form of personal defense against targeted commercial and even political influence? Because if they know your cognitive loopholes, they know exactly how to press your buttons.